Hi, I'm John Zombro with the Lifetime Athlete. And as a coach and a physio, I'm often asked the question, just how should my limbs move as they go through space? And so that's what I'm going to try to give you an explanation of today. And we want to think primarily in today's discussion about the appendicular skeleton, or in other words, the arm and the leg versus the axial skeleton. And specifically, I want to talk about how the shoulder is designed to harness triplanar motion, and the same for the hip. So that's what we're going to dive into. You may want to consider or have considered, well, how does my body generate movement? And nothing works in isolation. All things work together. So if you like to think about respiration mechanics and whether you're using an inhalation or an exhalation strategy and those biases, is your movement pattern concentric or eccentric? Do you have a compressive or expansive strategy employed there? What's happening with my pump handle sternum or my bucket handle rib cage when I'm moving? How does that tie in with respiration, the movement of the diaphragm, the pelvic floor, how the pelvis tilts or flares, and the sacrum nutates or counter-nutates to allow us to move? All of those things are quite valid, and they all work in synchronization or harmony with this movement of the limb through space. And so how I'd like to begin our discussion is to think about biomechanics. So that's really looking at how the line of pull of muscles helps to move our limbs, and also the joints and their architecture, that bony architecture or congruency, which will dictate the path that a limb will take. And so that's specifically called arthrokinematics. And a lot of big words just got thrown around, so don't worry, we're going to simplify because I'm going to go over to the whiteboard and try to break this down for you in just a couple of minutes. Yes, the mighty whiteboard. Have no fear, I'll make this fairly simple. So when we're talking about triplanar motion, or in other words, motion that's existing in three planes, and specifically the path of the limb, either the shoulder or the hip, and for our discussion, we're going to talk about a flexion arc, or raising through flexion and extension. Well, triplanar really means that motion exists in three planes. And so we have a frontal plane when we're viewing the body from the front, and we see side-to-side motion. We have that sagittal plane, which viewed from the side shows us forward-backward movement. And then also from the top down, we have rotation or a transverse plane. Now, one thing to keep in mind is these are cardinal planes, but they're rarely oriented in opposition to each other perfectly. A lot of times the direction or the projection of that plane is angled. So for example, this is rotation of my arm in the transverse plane. But now when I bring my arm out and rotate the arm, it's still rotation in the transverse plane. I've just oriented the plane to point more towards you than to point down. So good to keep that in mind. Now, moving right along, when we talk about this triplanar limb path, we're going to talk about the open kinetic chain with respect to the shoulder, and then the closed kinetic chain with the lower extremity, the hip. Well, all that means is that the chain, the open chain, the distal segment of the chain is moving freely through spaces. So that's an open chain. That's typically how our shoulder works, although it does have closed chain capacities as well. Now, with the closed kinetic chain, that's the foot on the ground. So that's how we're going to frame this discussion. What you'll notice in this kind of busy piece of artwork here is that there's a bit of an hourglass shape. And so when, I'm going to back out of the camera for you, when the arm is down, or when the leg is down, in other words, you're standing on your straight leg, we see a slight bias towards rotating outward or being externally rotated. And so that would be where the legs are slightly preferring to be externally rotated as opposed to internally when we're at our straightest point. In fact, you can even try that. If you get your legs fairly straight, it's very difficult to rotate them in. You have to flex or bend to get your legs to come in. That looked like a dance maneuver. Same is true at the shoulder. So what you'll notice is I have circled the rotations, and we tend to see a moving in towards the middle of motion. And so the shoulder will want to internally rotate as we approach kind of a mid-range. And here's the ancestral basis for that. We are designed to bring the hands to the mouth. And so as the shoulder, forget about the elbow and down for now, the shoulder is flexing in order to make it easiest to bring the hand to the mouth. It will also abduct or move out a bit and internally rotate. So this makes it very easy for us to, again, feed ourselves, which is critical for human function. So we have an internal rotation at mid-range. However, as soon as the arm begins to clear mouth level, it then externally rotates to prevent impingement at the shoulder and allow us to get our full flexion as it adducts back in towards midline. So kind of fancy talk there, but just think about the shoulder internally rotates largely due to this natural function. Now with the hip, it will also internally rotate near mid-range, and these things are never fixed. There's a span of range depending on your body type and the context of what you're doing with it that will dictate this. But knees coming in that mid-range is totally normal, and here's why. When we're straight, that's that stable, locked out position. And I'm actually going to try to get down and still be in the camera. If I go into a full squat, hopefully I didn't disappear from your view, and my hip comes up like that, it also wants to turn out, again, to help me with stability. But in the middle, what we really want is propulsive force. And so whether we're pushing up out of the hole in a squat or lowering in the descent or in our gait cycle, we have a flex knee. That's when we're going to have that internally rotated femur because it allows us to line up pressure on the medial aspect of the foot, particularly the medial ball of the foot. And so we're using a slightly, or even to a greater degree, pronated position in conjunction with the internal rotation. And those things are connected biomechanically, sometimes called obligatorily coupled. Well, when this happens, we get the best force and the best propulsion. Now, what you'll notice is that it's going to vary a little bit differently, let's say with your squat versus jumping or running. But as the leg approaches terminal extension, whether or not we're using it fully or not, we probably will in jumping, but we definitely don't want to do that while running. As we near the extension, we have to think about semantics or terms, and so that's why I've got ing versus ed. And so if I'm back to talking about the shoulder, we can say that the shoulder in this position is somewhat internally rotated, but if I keep moving, it's externally rotating as I'm going up. And so those things are always working in harmony. And then with the leg in particular, we want to think about that where the foot, when we're pushing off of it, is in most cases still pronated, but it is rapidly resupinating, or in other words, that rear foot is locking up and turning the foot into a rigid lever. That's the supination component, but we're still pronated enough to be able to push off our power, which is the big toe side. So hopefully this gives you a great explanation of arthrokinematics and that portion of biomechanics that dictates how our limbs are designed to move in space. Again, everyone's different with their anatomy. And so if you're noticing, gosh, I just don't seem to be moving quite as effectively as I wish I could in a plane, or maybe you have discomfort or pain, well, it could be because you're lacking something. Maybe you don't have enough rotational capacity to make those joints happy through range. Or conversely, you could have too much and have a little bit of difficulty controlling or stabilizing your mobility. So, hope you enjoyed this mini masterclass, which is actually what it turned out to be. And if you like this kind of information, feel free to check out the many resources that are available at thelifetimeathlete.com. Until next time, this is Coach John Zombro signing off. You are awesome.